Okay, so welcome everybody. We are here with Dr. Brett Favaro, who is now the lead strategist for climate at KPU, former Dean of Science. And thanks for making the time to be here.
Thanks for having me. And, one day I will be dean again. So this is not strictly in the past tense.
Okay.
Yes.
So this is, and I may have stumbled over the title. Did I get it right? Is it lead strategist of climate or climate strategist lead?
It's a great place to start. So we're calling me the climate strategy lead. And the genesis of this title, which doesn't exist anywhere on a hierarchical chart at KPU,
Right.
was trying to find a name for something that will exist to catalyze climate action at the university and exist to organize it around a set of principles that we can use to make decisions at this university.
Okay. And so you've been in this role for how long now?
I started at the beginning of September, so just a couple months at this point. And when we were conceiving of the position, it's modeled off a number of things, but one really good report is by the consulting firm Deloitte. And they have a term called climate strategy officer. Now, we don't have officers at a university, so it doesn't quite work. But it was designed around this idea that at really big companies, you often need a person because climate is nobody's job, right? It's everybody's job and it's nobody's job. And so you got to have somebody that sort of comes in and shakes things up a little bit and provides a framework that people can play in order to advance climate action at that institution. Now, in the university context, and really in any corporate context, in some ways, you've got a lot of different things this person could do, and it changes as time goes on. It can be somebody that's providing foresight, somebody that's providing research, somebody that's sort of shaking hands in the institution and getting people to think differently about their role in climate action. So it's a bit of a chameleon position in some ways, and it's time limited. I started in September. September next year, I'll be going back to being Dean of Science. So that's a really important principle here because what we want to do is get a lot done and then have that persist into the future.
So kind of catalyze change and just get people thinking
and it recognizes that climate change is happening fast.
Right.
And the pace at which you act matters in some cases more than the actions that you actually take. A really good reduction 10 years from now in cumulative emissions, from a cumulative emissions point of view, is not necessarily as good as getting a good chunk down right now, right? So
Right.
it's speed matters, and that's baked right into the conceptualization of what it is that we're trying to do here.
Right, because of that compounding effect and
Yeah.
that temporal impact. Yeah, that's a good point.
So what have you learned so far?
I've learned that KPU has a lot of people doing a lot of things on climate, but we don't all know about it. We don't
Right.
know what each other is doing.
Right.
And part of this, and I mean really broadly, like we often think about this from one academic department to another, that we don't necessarily know what each other's doing, but a university is more complicated than that. If you think about a university, it's this arena that we come to, that we contribute, we do research in it, we do teaching, we sort of conform to these historic norms, and it's very different than the outside world in some ways, right? The way that we have department chairs and we have sort of conduct and what happens in the classroom and academic freedom, like this type of thing doesn't exist in this way outside of the academy. But we're also a very conventional public sector institution where you've got an HR department and a facilities department and a place that sort of runs buildings. And so one of the things that I think, especially the polytech part of our name, gives us an opportunity to really embrace is linking those two sides of the house.
Mm.
Everybody, in my view, at KPU, in any role, is at their heart an educator. And if that is the central principle by which we conduct ourselves, then it follows that everything we do, we should figure out how to teach. Because that's what universities and colleges and post-secondaries can do that other parts of society are not equipped necessarily to do, nor are they required to do it. But we are. And that's, I think, where we need to live.
So do you think that the fact we're a polytechnic makes a difference to how KPU specifically can go about trying to walk the talk, basically?
I think so. I mean, I'll start by saying that when I have conversations with people about climate at KPU, there's different types of conversations you can have. And a lot of times people want to talk about, like, should I get a metal water bottle or a plastic one, right? Like those are those sort of really granular climate decisions, and those matter. But they're very operational. Strategy exists at a higher level. At the very top, we've got Vision 2026, which is sort of the president's vision that he consulted on, but it's ultimately the president's vision for all the different things that we're supposed to be doing as a post-secondary. Strategy, I think, is one tier below that. It's where we're creating sort of a framework by which we think about something with principles that we all more or less agree on that tell us how we should be thinking about things. And that's the space that I think the climate strategy needs to occupy. It will then require the creation of plans, right? So the next level, like how do we actually do these things, will come after we've all sort of agreed on a strategy. But the polytech, to answer your question, we're going to have to build an awful lot. For society to decarbonize, we're going to have a heat pump in every building. Every building's probably going to have solar panels on it. Most buildings are probably going to have energy storage. You're going to have district energy. You're going to have different transmission systems, right? So from a technical perspective, there's a lot of stuff that's going to happen that's going to look very different than how the world is now. And so that is one of our superpowers, that we've got trades in the same institution as all the other wonderful things that we do at KPU. And finding bridges and opportunities to work together across those, I think, is the place that we need to live.
And so just to be clear, so you're tasked with at the end of your 1-year term, which is already 1/4 of the way through, you're going to have this a strategy which sits at a very high level and which directs action for how we can achieve this kind of transformational change. Would you call it? Is it on the nature of transformational change that we're looking at here? Or?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, some of the things that need to be done on climate, in some ways we're doing them already, but we need to do them more, or we need to do them faster. So it's not entirely new things. I'll give you a great example. Everyone wants to talk about emissions reduction targets. Did you know KPU already has an 80% emissions reduction target? Because the province imposes that on us. By 2050, we're supposed to be down 80% on our emissions relative to 2007 levels. Maybe we want to achieve that faster. I don't know. We need to consult with the community and see what everybody says about this. But some of this is just a matter of sort of embracing that there's this task that's before us, right? So there's sort of, we can reluctantly drag ourselves to that. And emissions reduction is just one aspect of this. I don't want to get overly drawn into that, but it's one piece of it. It's an important piece. And so it's this thing that it already exists, but just acknowledging that it exists and really embracing it, being like, yeah, this is an opportunity for us to innovate. And then, and this is the critical part, teach everybody how we did it.
Yeah, that pedagogical element's what we're all about.
And if you look across post-secondaries in BC, this is increasingly being done. If you go to, for example, University of Okanagan, they're installing this ginormous heat pump on their campus, and they're going to have the ability for people to sort of follow along and look at it and see how it works. It's built by a company just in Kelowna. There's other examples like this if you scan across the sector where people are doing a thing and then teaching about that thing. And that's something that I think we can increase here at KPU. There's some of that happening. The term often people use is living lab. Our natural spaces are another example of this. The way that we landscape and the decisions that we make on what we plant and where and how we maintain it. These are all things that'll factor into this.
So would you, as an example, because you were talking about trades as one example and like how that could integrate potentially with other areas of the university, would you see something, let's just say potentially where there's these links made between trades and science that lead to innovations in, what trades does, but then that translates into the actual teaching of what trade, I'm just sticking with trades as an example, what they do as a faculty in terms of like how they can then transform the sector for that kind of innovation. Is that part of the strategy, if you will? Or?
So one of the challenges at a university and also opportunities is that unlike corporation, you want there to be some chaos in the sense that you want an open arena that people can play in, because I can't tell you when people listen to this or when they think about it or when they eventually read the climate strategy and hopefully put in their 2 cents about it, they're going to have their own ideas and they're going to be things I've never thought of. Right. Mm-hmm. And you need to make space for that to happen. That sort of chaotic faculty to faculty, student to faculty, student to student sort of opportunity for people to just come up with their own thing. Provided it's aligned with these basic principles, I think that there's an opportunity for lots of stuff we've never even thought of to occur. And that's where a lot of real innovation happens in the post-secondary space. There is also the top down, let's invest strategically, sort of administration working hand in hand with faculty and students let's invest in some bigger projects, right? Where we're sort of directing resources a little bit more specifically. And those things have to be able to exist. If you're only top down, then you've robbed people of agency. You've removed the ability of people to really contribute to this. If you're entirely sort of that bottom up basis, you miss out on some opportunities as well, because certain big grant funding, for example, really does require that institutional coordination to provide the supports needed to make it work. And there's a big history in Canada of this, like, I'm talking like the tens of millions of dollar grant type projects that you see some post-secondaries really go after. And those often have a lot of different roles for people, but you are part of a bigger project then.
I guess one of the things with the strategy is it's going to have to be in place for a period of time, and it's going to have to be able to respond to events that are as yet unanticipated or unknown. So when you're thinking about the strategy, what kind of timeline are you thinking it will be operational for? Like, do these things have a lifespan themselves? Or?
Well, it's interesting. So if you look across KPU, we have a lot of things that I think we use the word strategy plan sort of interchangeably sometimes. Does it matter that we have a firewall between a strategy and plan? I don't know. I'm just trying to stay organized in my thinking as much as possible, because climate can pull you in any different direction, because climate is everything. It can pull you in every direction. And so trying to figure out a way to stay focused that respects, what we got going on at KPU. We have really good justice-based strategies / plans. The HEAH plan, the indigenization pathways plan, is it's out there. We've got the accessibility, the anti-racism. We've got a sustainability plan already. So you can look at all these, and I've been trying to figure out, like, in each of these plans that are out there, what has already been said about climate. And they don't always use the word climate, but it's inferred in some ways in some of the calls to action, right? And some of the recommendations or pathways or different terms that they've used across reports. So part of the strategy as well, because climate is a justice issue, is figuring out how we use a climate strategy to advance all the other axes of justice that we have already committed to as an institution, and put it into this sort of framework where we're multi-solving, right? Elizabeth Sawin is a commentator on climate, and she has this term multi-solving. I think she wrote a book on it. And it's this concept that when you have limited time and resources, as much as possible, you should be looking for things that solve multiple axes at once. And climate's a great example of that.
Right.
So how does it intersect with justice? I mean, this is a huge theme of this podcast, and I feel like we ask all of our guests a similar question. How do you see the intersection of issues of justice and climate?
So everything I'm saying today is my own opinion. It doesn't reflect KPU's official opinion. The strategy itself needs to be ratified by everybody. We got to go through a whole process for that. This is just where my head is at right now. I think of climate justice as being necessary but insufficient for all other kinds of justice. You can decarbonize in an unjust way, right? You can turn off all the coal power plants and concentrate all the power in renewables and have it all be controlled by one monopoly, and, extract all the resources unsustainably and do all those things in the wrong way. And the climate may stabilize. And that's good that the climate would stabilize, but you've missed an opportunity to be transformative in so many other ways. So it's necessary. I say that because in a future where we continue to be dependent on oil and gas in the way that we are now, there will be no justice. In a world that's 3-4 degrees Celsius warmer than it is now, the conditions for organized society to persist will simply not be there. And we will see tremendous injustice.
Yeah. So we will be decarbonized, but
we're decarbonizing one way or the other. The question is whether we do it
yes.
in an organized fashion or not.
Yes.
Let me ask you about, let's go back in time just a little bit, because one of the things that you did is you wrote a book. The title of the book is The Carbon Code: How You Can Become a Climate Change Hero. And it's interesting, you note on the blog that although this book was written in 2017, I think you say on the blog that the problem is getting worse, but also the scope for the solutions is greater. Can you talk a little bit about the carbon code?
Sure.
And then also that second piece about, where things have changed since you wrote the book.
So I'll start with the book. So I actually wrote it in 2016 because it was published in 2017. So think about this. Obama was president when I wrote that book, right? We didn't know any of what was coming next or where we are now. And I wrote it. It's a kind of a funny story. So I was a fisheries conservation person when I worked at the Fisheries Marine Institute and Memorial University in Newfoundland and Labrador. And I was doing my animal care permit. So anyone that's done research involving animals knows you got to sit there and type out your animal care when you're proposing to do a project. And as I was writing this animal care thing, I was thinking about how we use big ships. So when we use big boats to go do marine research, they consume a lot of fuel. It's very expensive research, in part just because of the fuel. And so I got to thinking, boy, all this stuff in fisheries, again, a stable climate is necessary but insufficient for sustainable fisheries. In a hotter world, fisheries will collapse, right? You can manage them better, and that'll help buffer you to some extent. But cod can only live in water that's a certain temperature. Once it gets above that temperature, they swim away, and so you don't have a fishery. And so I was thinking about the use of carbon in this study. So I'm writing all this stuff about animal care, and again, my social license to do that research requires that I be accountable in how I use those animals. But there's no such accountability on carbon. So I can burn as much as I want and do that research and no one will question me. So I was reading, does anyone written about this in science? And I found a blog post from somebody, I don't remember their name. And it was basically just saying, yeah, boy, I sure use a lot of fuel. And then they just sort of shrugged. And so I wrote a letter to the journal Science, which proposed a carbon code of conduct for research. And it was sort of one of these undeveloped ideas. It was just we've got these R's in animal research, right? Reduce, refine, replace, and rehabilitate. That actually translates pretty well over to carbon. We still need to do that work. You still need to use animals in research. But we have a framework for it. We have to participate in the fossil fuel economy, but how do we do so ethically? And so I put that forward. And what actually ended up happening is one of the editors from Johns Hopkins University Press called me up on the phone and said, hey, I read your thing in Science. That might make a cool book. And so that was the genesis of it. So then I started to flesh it out and sort of turn it into a more general piece of advice. But the hook of it, how you can become a climate change hero, was intended to equip everybody to be climate change heroes. It's not that there's one super person that does it. This is something, our chief project as people that know something and care about climate is to get as many people around us into the game. Because you can't solve it with a small number of people. That's not how it works. Even a US president that's sympathetic to it cannot do it alone. You have to have a whole whackload of people, bigger than any movement we've had before.
Mm-hmm. So the carbon code, reduce, replace, refine, and rehabilitate. So this is reduce one's own use of carbon, replace carbon-intensive actions with less carbon-intensive actions. Mm-hmm. Refine, so the carbon that you do burn, you get the most out of.
Yeah.
And then rehabilitate. Do what we can to fix the problem that we've already created, perhaps through offsets and whatnot.
Yeah, and in the book, I do go with offsetting. Now, my opinion is somewhat evolved on the efficacy of offsetting since the time that I wrote that, because more evidence has come out. But yeah, that was the gist of it.
So do those principles inform the work that you're doing now on the KPU strategy?
Sort of, I think implicitly. I've sort of moved away. There is one piece of that I don't think aged really well, and it is a fairly individualistic approach to climate justice. So if you have some people doing this and everybody else not, it does put you sort of in this awkward position. And I think I'm increasingly coming around to a different framing on all this. Understanding climate change and the energy transition and the physical transition that will flow from it, is a exercise in building certainty. So we're about to enter into this world we are entering, and every year things seem to get moving faster, more unpredictably, more chaotically. Next year, January, do you hear natural gas is going to go up 17.5% in BC?
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah.
No.
So if you are subject to these wild swings, the way to build certainty into your life is to electrify, because now you know what you're going to be paying next year, right? The little things like that and big things as well. You'll understand where people are going to be moving from and to. You may not know exactly when, but you can be directionally correct if you understand the climate transition.
Right.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So I just wanted to ask you to expand on that a little bit more, because this is the first I've heard of this, because I know that when we're talking about climate change, and people used the word Anthropocene to signify the moving into a new geologic era where non-linearity is the name of the game. So we're moving out of this period of relative stability in which civilizations have grown and flourished, and into time when unexpected Earth system events will just be, something that happen. And so there's a lot of talk about uncertainty, and scholars have written about, the management of uncertainty and that kind of thing. But you're talking about something a little bit different, which is building certainty. But you're talking about building certainty in the context of increasing uncertainty in the Earth system. And so just walk us through that again.
Climate's about holding seemingly opposing views in your mind all the time, right? What I really mean by this is we sort of know the ways in which the wheels are going to come off the bus. We know
Right. So
where
there's a kind of certainty within the uncertainty.
Yeah.
Like a certain uncertainty.
and the basic principle, I mean, we know 2/3 of climate change is from burning fossil fuels, 1/3 is from land use. So, the bulk of the problem gets solved very quickly when you step away from technology that consumes fossil fuels. I have this graph sometimes when I do a talk, and it just shows my own household, right? And it's like as you go from a gas to an electric vehicle, as you go from your natural gas furnace to a heat pump, and it's just these big step changes in what your annual emissions are. To the point where if everything's electrified, especially here in BC where we have non-emitting electricity, it's no impact, it's non-emitting, you have very few emissions as an individual. And so, a lot of the environmental movement, we've tried these behavioral approaches where we sort of say to people, you got to take a shorter shower or whatever. But there's other solutions, right? And
Right.
and that's where the central argument of the carbon code was essentially behavioral in a way.
Right.
And I think there's a fair amount of empirical evidence that doesn't necessarily work at a wide scale. It works for some people, but it's difficult to build that in, especially when other pressures start to feel more prescient.
Because I think that has been the primary approach. I mean, I think still, it may perhaps in general, when it comes to tackling the climate crisis, is individualistic. And which makes sense because we live in a consumer society, right? So the natural go-to is like focus on the individual and the decisions you can make in the marketplace and so on, which is all great. I think like we need to be as responsible as we can as individuals. But I feel like, there's consumption and there's production, and the focus is on consumption. It's very rarely on production, but we think of consumption as driving production in kind of a classical economic way, right? There's demand, and then that demand is met by the marketplace, by corporations, and so on. But really, I think it's a dynamic, but I think very much production drives consumption. There's this production that has to be met to produce profit, and so it's got to be consumed, and so we're going to manufacture that desire, right? That need to consume.
And again, you have to have conflicting ideas in your head. So on the one hand,
it is. I was going to point that out.
On
Yeah,
the
it's
one
one of these
hand, somebody's got to lead.
Yeah.
Right. So if you have the means and capacity to be that first person to prominently ride your bicycle to work every day and tell everybody about why and how you do that, nothing happens without somebody leading. At the same time, that individual decision isn't enough. I think where this really comes in is things like transit use. So if somebody's in a situation where driving to work would take them 20 minutes, but it's 2 hours by bus, right? It's going to be hard to convince that person to take the bus. If, however, the bus is also 20 minutes, then it won't be as hard. And so these decisions that we make exist in a system.
Exactly.
And so we have to figure out, how do we lead as individuals and even as a university? How do we lead while we bring other people along with us, right? And then work to change the system so that those decisions that are the good ones, right, or the ones that are more in alignment with where we need to be going from a climate perspective, how do we make those beneficial as opposed to a sacrifice?
Yeah. I think you're exactly right. Like it's a back and forth, right? Like we change the structure in the system from within.
I'll put it another way. So last week I attended Clean Energy BC has this First Nations Energy Summit. It was a 2-day conference, almost entirely Indigenous governments and communities on panels talking about the way their communities have embraced or are embracing or want to embrace clean energy. And the entire conference was solutions focused. And it was communities saying, look, we're doing this to benefit ourselves. It wasn't a sacrifice. Nobody there was talking sacrifice. It was saying we want to have transmission lines go in our territory and own them. so we can use that to benefit our community. And it was just, I think it's a very advanced way of thinking about this. And it was a very inspirational event. And it also showed that a lot of that leadership is coming from Indigenous governments and communities. They're saying, we don't want to be using diesel. We want to be using renewables. And this is how we want to be doing it. And you better come to the table and work with us on it. And it was a great event. And I think it also shapes a lot of my thinking about this. Again, that climate action also supports indigenization on their terms, not on my terms.
Right. Yeah.
I have a question, which is thinking about a strategic strategy. So how do you, what's your thinking around how to put into place a strategy and what that is going to have, buy-in from multiple levels, I guess?
First of all, anyone can email me. So I'm happy to meet with anybody in the KPU community that wants to talk about this. So that's the first thing. You can put my email on the website or whatever. But secondly, there is going to be a structure. So sort of any big institutional project, there's always a committee. So we'll have a committee sort of that's selected of people that are across the institution on the faculty and staff and administration and students and operations and academics. So that's the access that we don't often have in these committees is across the two sort of solitudes of the institution. This committee I will work with them to develop an engagement plan. So part of it is just, who do we know we need to talk to? Who do we sort of proactively need to schedule meetings with? And then I'll go and meet with everybody. There will also be sort of, I'll call it passive engagement in the sense that, you can just email me and we can set up a time to talk, or you can invite me and I'll come out and talk to you. But consulting really, really widely. I mean, the best things that we have at KPU with the most support are the ones that have been really widely consulted on. If you go to any Senate meeting, those are open. So anybody can go to a Senate meeting and observe. You'll see a lot of the program proposals and stuff like that. It has a list of who did you consult with. And they're often really, really long, right? And it's a thing that we do certainly on the academic side of the university, getting everybody's feedback on it. But that core team, I do expect more of them, right? In the sense that there's going to be some reading and there's going to be some really thinking deeply about what is a strategy as opposed to a plan. And we'll see what happens. I mean, I tentatively will start meeting as a committee in January or February, depending on people's availability. And then sort of do a few rounds ourselves, and then we'll open it up. We'll have a few months of consultation, and we'll just see where we go. Eventually, we'll come back and we'll have to come up with a final strategy that then we seek ratification for. But it's going to be a journey, and I'm hesitant to give firm timelines on it just yet because who knows? One of the really important things is how are we engaging the host First Nations, and do they want to engage with us, and in what capacity, and how do we do it respectfully and in the right order, right? So these are all different considerations that we have to make sure we're doing the right way.
When you say ratification, who ratifies this?
So again, this is something that doesn't exist anywhere. If you're doing an academic program, it's very easy to know because, the Senate signs off on it, goes to the Board of Governors, and you're good to go. So with a climate strategy, who does need to sign off on it? We have various other plans that have been signed off at the director level or, even the president or different groups here and there. I guess my answer is I don't fully know, but I'd like as many as possible. Right.
Yeah.
So we'll see if we can rack it up. I mean, I imagine eventually this will have to go before the board. I have observed when I've gone across looking at other post-secondaries that the ones that are these really impactful sort of multi-administration really sticks around, the board is involved, right? They do that. So I don't know. I don't want to speak very firmly about that yet. It's a journey that we're all on here, but I would say as widely as possible.
Cool.
Right. Yeah. Sounds great. Well, thanks for sharing your thoughts and your plans for the journey.
What else? I mean, we're half an hour into this, so we've had 30 minutes, 29 minutes to be, and 34 seconds to be exact.
Okay.
But what else is relevant that we haven't touched on yet? I mean, because you also talked just in there about consulting with First Nations, right? Like local First Nations, and this is obviously massively important as well. I feel like there's so many parts to this conversation. What else do we need to be thinking about?
Well, I hope it's okay to say her name. I mean, when we met with the folks last week, Alison Hottie was there, and she made that really important statement. I think that was shaping about that First Nations component, right? And
just so our listeners know, Alison is chair of the Indigenous Studies Department at KPU, and also a current Climate Plus Challenge Fellow. As am I. And so the Climate Plus Challenge team had a conversation with Brett last week, and that's what you're referring to.
Yeah. And I mean, it's a great point, and it's a matter of, intentions don't matter as much as what you materially do in a lot of cases. And so I'm cognizant of that. And so figuring out how that works with this strategy is something that I don't have all the answers for at this point. And so I'm coming on this podcast in this weird space where there's thinking about it. It's very fluid. It's not set in stone right now, but I think it's the right time to start going a little bit more public with it so that people can have their input and share their ideas.
Yeah, that's great. And so are there any other kind of things that you want to have feedback on?
I guess I'd say my door is wide open. I mean, one of the challenges with anything to do with climate is that it can go in a million different directions. And I've been keeping this personal log of how many conversations I've had with people in meetings just about climate. And if I count this podcast as one of those, this is number 78 since the beginning of September.
Wow.
These are private conversations. It's not the type of like official public consultation that you would post. I've talked to these people. It's just sort of conversations, right? Do you understand where everybody's at? And the conversations range from, Brett, should I get plastic cups or paper cups? Right? All the way, and anything in between. And the space that I would really like to be occupying right now is not the cup question. It's how do we make the decision about the cup, right? It's what values infuse us as we approach that question of how we make the decision about the cup. What are the principles we're going to adhere to? I mean, one of them that I'll go out on a limb and just put it out there, I think needs to be in here, is the principle that we embrace our legal and moral duty to be leaders in this space. It's a fairly simple statement, but I think it's important. So one of the formative experiences I had when I lived in Newfoundland and Labrador was I worked with a couple folks to organize a conference there called Decarbonize NL, Decarbonize Newfoundland and Labrador. And our impetus for doing it was that there was no conference that was explicitly talking about a post-oil economy in that province, which people may or may not realize is an oil province, right? Like that's a big chunk of their government revenues as well. And culturally, oil's a big deal there. And so we had this conference and we wanted to have really high production values and make it slick, right? Like make it look like a professional event. We pulled quite a cool event together. We had about 150 people there. It was wall-to-wall coverage on CBC. We had Catherine McKenna, the former environment minister. She did a video address for us. And so it was, it was legit. And at that event, we broke the economy into several different sectors. And we had these little roundtable discussions, basically. We had a panel of experts talk about how they're working to decarbonize their field. And then we threw it to the audience. Basically, just had whiteboards or flip charts, where you just write down what are your ideas in the sector. And it was really just trying to create a positive space where it's like, let's talk about this. And we had one rule. The rule was, well, we had a couple rules because we had a code of conduct as well. But the main rule was, you are here to talk about how, not whether.
Right.
And we said that over and over again. And even in the conference, we said, look, if you're slipping back into whether, refund fully will be given to you at the door, right? But that's not what we're here to do. And no harm done. And boy, we had some productive conversations. And I knew it was good because the premier was mad at us. He was then had to do this little thing afterwards and was like, that they're just a bunch of youngsters and they had so that was informative for me because it showed the power of not naively positive conversations, but mission-driven conversations where you're focused on something and you're not getting distracted constantly and you're sort of dividing things up in an organized way while also all getting together and having fun with it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
Yeah.
Breaking this part of that is, and I just have to mention too, because we watched the interview you did with Jesse Ventura. And it was such we were talking earlier about holding these kinds of oppositional things in mind at the same time. And that was an experience because it was the first time I'd ever really watched Jesse. I mean, I remember this guy from
the WWF.
Yeah, he was a wrestler, a professional wrestler.
Yeah.
Now, governor of Michigan or something.
He was a governor of Minnesota.
Minnesota.
Yeah.
Sorry, America. But yeah, the intro to the show is all like him acting tough, hopping on his motorbike, roaring off on his motorbike. He's got his leathers on, and then he had a very genuine exchange with you around climate change, where he was. Because the tone that was set was somewhat contrarian. So I thought he was going to be holding you over the coals or something, but he was very supportive of the message that you were giving. That was around the time when the book, The Carbon Code, had just come out. And one of the things that you mentioned in there was the low cost action of breaking the spiral of silence. Yeah, which I thought was like a really
that term was crafted by
Yeah.
Catherine Hayhoe, the climate scientist from Texas, and she talks about the spiral of silence. And the spiral of silence is this idea that you go home for Christmas and you sit down at the dinner or whatever your winter holiday is that you celebrate, and you've got your uncle that says climate change is a hoax and da 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 da, and they're loud and they're boisterous, and that's probably what everybody believes, right? Because I'm too afraid to say anything and nobody else at the table is saying anything. So I guess that's what everybody agrees.
Right.
We don't talk about climate. We don't even talk about climate when a climate disaster happens. And in fact, I would argue that there's a concerted effort to create different causes of when there's a major weather disaster. When you hear wildfires, immediately now you hear arson, 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 arson. Even though, first of all, there's no evidence that that's true. Second of all, if it was true, you still couldn't burn down the forest 40 years ago. It just wouldn't have happened to the same way. I mean, there were wildfires back then, but the frequency and intensity and the ease with which human activities can start fires now is much easier, and it's going to continue to get easier. And so we're going to have to manage forests differently in addition to polluting less, right? So these antibodies come in to try to make you feel a certain way about it. And that's the spiral of silence. It's just being like, no, guys, it is climate. No, folks, it is climate.
Or even when it is discussed as climate change, it's like the new normal, right? So it gets discussed in this way that
or it's
kind
doomed.
of naturalizes it.
It's the new normal, or we're doomed and it's too late to do anything about it, which is wrong. It's never going to be too late to do anything about it. In a world that's 4 degrees Celsius warmer than now, it's going to be better than 4.1. So there's never an end point to this.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Every little bit matters.
And that's, I think, the inspiring thing here is that if KPU can avert 0.0001 degrees of global warming, that is a gift to current and future generations that you almost can't put a price on it. Even a small amount like that, right?
Right.
Because, it's one of these weird problems where everything is small in climate. Even the single biggest categories are never more than like, this industry is 10% of emissions or 12%. It's never a big number, right? So no matter how big you are, you can always say, I'm too small to matter.
And people do, right? Canada says that, right?
People say it all the time.
We're only
right?
2% of emissions. Or
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. But
2% is massive.
It's massive,
we're one of the top in the world.
per
in
capita,
absolute terms,
I think we're
per
almost
capita,
the
we're way
worst.
at the top. But even in absolute terms, I think we're in the top 10. Like we're a big polluter in Canada. And so what we do matters an awful lot.
It's a massive collective action problem, but that's why we have to think collectively.
Look how quickly things go viral, right? Like look how quickly things can get normalized and things can get denormalized.
Right.
Think about litter, right? You don't have to go too far back into history. It was before I was born, but people would just take garbage and dump it. Do you guys watch Mad Men? You watch that show?
I still think of that scene
when Betty Draper's in the park and just throws all the garbage in the park.
I know.
Evidently, that was normal, and now people would be horrified.
Well, I'm old enough that when I was a kid, I can remember there being so much in the UK, but not just in the UK. Like there was just litter everywhere. But now it's like, you're right. People would be horrified. So
smoking. I mean, you could have like the smoking section of the restaurants and airplanes and whatnot. Yeah.
Actually, a flight I was just on, somebody smoked on the plane.
Did they?
Yeah, it caused a big emergency. All the flight attendants had to run back.
Wow.
It was like someone who's like 80 years old and hadn't been on a plane in 4 decades. Maybe.
Yeah, well, but I think
sometimes people do it out of principle, right?
But it speaks to climate in a way. That's called bridging, folks, if you're learning science communication. Bridging back to climate is that there's always going to be somebody that is rolling coal in their pickup truck or is smoking on the airplane. Like that doesn't mean the project is failing. And I think that's another thing that, there will be setbacks, but setbacks are occurring and we may see a real big one south of the border pretty soon, maybe even here before too long. Right. But setbacks don't imply that it's all for nothing, because there are also successes. The price of solar is plummeting. The price of battery storage is plummeting. Right. The social norms around putting solar on your house are improving. The values that people have, though people are ranking climate change lower in their concern, when you look at public polls, the things that are the consequences of climate are rising. People just don't realize that yet. And if we can craft those narratives and make people understand that inflation that you hate, yeah, that's a climate thing, right? Those grocery prices going up, yeah, that's going to keep happening. That's a climate thing,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
Water scarcity, it's not just a climate thing, but it is a climate thing. And so being able to make those connections and giving people a clear action. People talk about eco-anxiety and how we shouldn't tell the truth about climate because it's too overwhelming for people and they'll disconnect and they'll get scared. Yeah, if we don't give them something to do, I'll give you something to do. If you see somebody burning fossil fuels, figure out how not to do that. Right? That's the solution.
Right. Yeah. Inspiring words.
All right.
Motivating words. Yes.
Well, thank you, Brett, for making the time to be with us today.
Well, thank you for having me. And I am sincere. If people want to talk climate strategy or climate change in general, you'll post my email on the show notes, I guess, and they're welcome to shoot me a line and we'll find a time to have a chat.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot.